entire knowledge of Dungeons and Dragons in the 80s was based entirely on the movie E.T. because the kids in E.T. play Dungeons and Dragons.
I'm ready to play now, you guys!
We're in the middle, Elliot. Can't you join any universe in the middle?
It was always the smart kid who played it, so that's probably why I didn't.
I've seen films about people that play Dungeons and Dragons and they're serial killers.
In the late 70s, Gary Gygax loses his job in insurance. So Gary fills the hours, yes, you guessed it, dreaming up fantasy war games in, of course, his basement. Little did he imagine the game he dreams up will become one of the decade's most controversial.
Dungeons and Dragons, it's basically a role-playing fantasy game. You've got the players who are creating their characters. You have a dungeon master who is setting up the story.
You also had weird-shaped dice. And 40 years ago, the game gets popular amongst the unpopular kids.
Dungeons and Dragons was nerd heaven. If you felt like your own life sucked, if you were getting picked on, if you felt like you were a puny little kid, you could be some like kick-ass elf with a bow and arrow, right? And you felt empowered.
It would feel much better if we knew that we were a superhero or a mighty wizard of the stamp of Conan or Merlin or whoever.
Being a nerd started to become kind of a cool thing in the 80s a little bit, and I think Dungeons and Dragons was definitely part of that.
Soon, D&D clubs spring up in schools all across America. But by the mid-'80s, as the game's legend spreads, parents start to panic. Why this time?
This morning, we're going to take up the controversy surrounding the game Dungeons and Dragons, which some parents fear could lead to violence and suicide.
There was a big scare about Satanism, about sorcery, and Dungeons and Dragons, seemed like it was part of this dark netherworld.
There was a movie that came out in the 80s with Tom Hanks that was about like a Dungeons and Dragons inspired moral panic. People were scared of this stuff.
I am Pardieu, a holy man. In reaching the 9th level, I have acquired many magic spells and charms, the greatest of which is the Graven Eye of Timur.
Anything in the 80s that seemed like it was slightly dabbling in magic was really terrifying to especially, people in the Bible Belt, to some parents.
Despite concerns, there is no evidence the game is involved in any teen deaths. If anything, the bad press encourages more kids to buy the game. By 1986, it attracts around 4 million fanatical followers. Dungeons and Dragons captured the imagination of a generation. And when those kids grow up, they're destined to dream up even bigger fantasy worlds.
The creators of Game of Thrones, I know, play D&D even today. So it helped, I think, inspire a lot of creative people.
I know that it inspired Stranger Things.
A shadow grows on the wall behind you, swallowing you in darkness. It is almost here. What is it?
A lot of the monsters and things in the show are taken directly from Dungeons and Dragons.
The Demogorgon!
And just be careful who you call a nerd.
And Colder the Witch Hunter.
Attack! Dungeons and Dragons typically has been associated with your nerd. And now, all these years later, those geeks and nerds have grown up to rule the world.